Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Rousseau's Political Economy. We're finishing, today we're going to be looking at the third section, as we said, Political Economy, which was an article in the Encyclopedie by Diderot, edited by Diderot, Volume 5 of Encyclopedia. It logically has 5 points: the introduction, then number one, number two, number three, and then the conclusion. So we're in the fourth video of this series. So we'll be doing look at three, and three goes from page 224 in the Masters edition. The Masters edition of Social Contract with the Geneva manuscript and the Political Economy, as well as to page 232. So let's go look at it. 3. It is not enough to have citizens and protect them. It is also necessary to think about their subsistence. In other words, subsistence, how they live, how they live, how they're going to be living, how they're going to feed themselves, how they're going to provide for themselves, subsist. To subsist is living. This is not only in terms of food, but also in terms of employment and labor and work that allows them to get their food, right? And providing for the public needs is the evident consequence of the general will, and the third essential duty of the government. So, therefore, remember the numbers of there is the duties of government. Right? Um, so, providing for its, giving its, protecting the citizens and not giving them education is not making citizens in that sense. It is also what providing the means by which they can have their sustenance, or this. Thus, providing the public needs is the evident consequence of the general will. This duty is not, as it should be apparent, to fill the granaries of private individuals and dispense them from working, Now, it was filled of private individuals and dispense them from working, rather to maintain abundance within their reach, so that to acquire it, work is always necessary and never useless. So this is not social welfare. Rousseau is not a father of the government is supposed to be taking the granaries and giving the people the means of it. No. Rather, it is to provide the environment. His argument is to what? It is to, but rather to maintain abundance, the overall economy, to make it abundant. So that they can get the most that they can. The economy can grow. Growth. He's a growth man. He sounds like a supply sider, man, right? Build the growth. Not transfer the money to them, but rather provide the growth by which the economy and the thing is there, so that they can see. It's what he says. What he says right here, that it is that it's abundance within their reach, and work is always necessary and never useless. Right? It's the idea of working. You have to work. You need to work. Work is necessary, not useless. It also extends to all operations concerning the maintenance of the public treasury and the expenses of the public administration. So not only does it deal with the economy in terms of making sure there's abundance, and that people not necessarily overabundance, but enough abundance that people that they can see the wealth out there, that they can work to make sure they can enjoy they can sustain them. There's enough abundance that people can sustain themselves. Okay, through work. And that work is not useless. And also, this extends this idea of the economy here, protected sustenance, deals with what? This is maintaining the public treasury and deal with the expenses of the public administration, so the cost of doing all the necessary things necessary to maintain the public good, right? Thus, after discussing the general economy in relation to the government of persons, it remains for us to consider it in relation to administration of goods. So therefore, now the question we talked about in general, right? The general economy in terms of in relations to persons. Now we have to pay attention now to the question that is making sure the wealth's out there. Now it's going to be what maintaining the administration, covering for this. This part offers no fewer difficulties to resolve or contradictions to overcome than the preceding one. It is certain that the right of property is the most sacred of all rights of citizens, and more important in certain respects than freedom itself, because either because it is more closely connected with the preservation of life, or because since goods are easier to usurp, more difficult to protect than one's persons, greater respect should be accorded what can more easily been stolen, or finally because property is the true basis of civil society and the true guarantee of the citizens' engagements. Whoa! Sounds like a classical liberal here. Sounds like John Locke. Sounds like Adam Smith, right? What is he saying here? He's saying that okay, that this is going to be more difficult, as difficult as other issues, and when it happens here, what he's saying that why, it's in other sense goods. He says that property is the most sacred right in that sense, right? Why? It's even more so than freedom. Why? Because it's closely connected with survival, life, preserving of life. And also why? Because since goods are easier to usurp and more difficult to protect than our bodies. In other words, having our lives taken away from us or having our bodies harmed, we immediately know that. But having our wallets picked and things like this, we put up with it. So he's saying that therefore this is more. In other words, our greater respect should be accorded to what can be easily stolen, or finally, because property is a true basis of civil society. No, civil society requires property ownership. Very important. Rousseau is not a communist. It's not communal ownership. It is property. You have to have property. Everyone has to have property. And this is what civil society means. That civil society means that everyone has property. That they have a property that is theirs, that it belongs to them, and that they're able. And yes, that there's going to be something that they share. That they share life together and a community together. But the property is always going to be grounded in the private sphere, right, of individuals and families. And it's the true guarantor of the citizens' engagement. Remember what he said? The rich, remember, go back before the previous section, he warned about the rich and the poor. The very poor have nothing, and therefore they have nothing. They don't they don't feel things. They have nothing, and they have nothing to lose. And because of that, and because they have little and nothing, the nets, the laws and the rules don't really have much impact on them. Law, he says, usually affects those of middling wealth, the middle, people who have something. Now, the wealthy, he uses that metaphor of the very wealthy being too powerful, and that the poor being so small, that the law basically impacts and shapes and restrains and affects the moderate, those of moderate means. And therefore, that's why, from Aristotle's book 4, chapter 11, he talks about the importance of the mean, right? The danger of the wealthy and the poor. This is a bad thing, because why? The laws are like nets, he made a metaphor. The wealthy break through nets, and the poor just go through the nets. Okay, they're too small. The net doesn't provide or protect for them. So this is the point he wants to make here. This is why the true the property is the true guarantees of citizens. That property gives them a stake, and they have a stake. They have a stake. their property, they have the property, they have means, and therefore they have a stake in the community. This idea that the poor is going to be citizens, no, or people without stakes, no, they won't. They have nothing. They have nothing at stake, and they become what they become. They don't see they don't believe in this. They don't share the citizen value. Okay. Um, for if goods were not held accountable, in other words, for if goods were not held accountable for persons, nothing would be so easy as to elude one's duties and to scoff the laws. In other words, you couldn't. In other words, if in other words, we could, if we didn't have goods in other words, that were tied to us, we could easily elude our duties and scoff at laws, right? On the other hand, it is no less certain that the maintenance of the state and the government requires costs and expenses. So therefore, in other words, certain that the maintenance of the state and the maintenance of the government requires costs and expenses. And since anyone who grants the ends cannot refuse the means, therefore, anyone who grants the end of these things, at the end of society, the grants the ends of society, state, and government, can't refuse the means. If you grant the ends, that the purpose of the state, that we live together, and that government is the necessary administration for us to live together, you grant them. You say that, okay, yes, we need them. We grant that these things are, and that they are necessary. Then we have to grant the means to do them, right? The resources. It follows that the members of society should contribute some of their goods to its upkeep. So therefore, they contribute. They contribute some, not all their goods, some of their goods to upkeep. So a balance, not everything, but enough, something that everyone pays their fair share. That everyone will pay their fair share, their share. Um, uh, uh, um, Everyone should contribute to some of their goods for its upkeep. Moreover, it is difficult to assure the property of private individuals on the one hand without attacking it on the other. In other words, moreover, it's difficult to assure the property of private individuals on the one hand without attacking it on the other. And it isn't possible for all the regulations concerning inheritance, wills, and contracts not to constrain the citizens in certain respects regarding the disposition of their own goods and consequently regarding the property rights. In other words, okay, this is where he's saying you can't, in other words, this idea of absolute freedom of contract and have no regulation, this is not going to happen. Because the nature of protecting property and also to ensure that there is property that the Commonwealth or the states is able to exist, and the people who are able to exist in it, there has to be regulations, right? And he says that you can't. In other words, the difficulty to assure property of private individuals, protecting it, right? On the one hand, it also means the attacking it on the other. Why? Once you're going to guarantee something, protect it, you're also going to regulate it, and therefore that's going to have costs, and you're going to have to maintain those costs, and have to maybe take some things of it, or that they're going to have to decide who's right. Regulations concerning inheritance, wills, contracts, not to constrain, not. In other words, all the regulations concerning these things, inheritance, wills, and contracts, right? That the regulations on contracts, that there's no fraud, there's honesty of this. This is going to be regulating someone. You're going to be what? Constrain citizens in certain respects regarding the disposition of their own goods, and consequently regarding their rights of property. So therefore, you can never, it's not an absolute right to property. Yes, it is an absolute. It is a fundamental right. It's necessary, but it's not something that we can do what we will, do what we want, merely at whim. We are restrained. We are restrained by our needs, what we need for ourselves, and the longevity, our obligations to our children and our inheritance, those who are coming after us. But we're also constrained to our fellow citizens, in the sense that we need to pay our share of the costs and maintenance of our shared protection and administration of the state and the state itself, right? But besides what I've already said about the harmony that prevails between the authority of the laws and the freedom of the citizen, there is, in relation to the disposition of goods, one important remark to be made that overcomes many difficulties. So it's one that it was given. I've said everything's about the question of laws and freedom of citizens, the question of laws, and that's earlier section 2 and section 1, right? He says now there's one additional remark that overcomes many difficulties in sense, the question of of harmony. It is, as Pufendorf has shown, that by nature of the right of property, it does not extend beyond the life of the proprietor, and that the instant a man is dead, his goods no longer belong to him. Okay, so therefore, the proprietor says the property you only loan, it's yours. Property is only time to your life. And this is a very Roman. But what about families? What about institutions and corporations? What about private things? It seems to be the argument that a person's ownership of property is tied to their life, and once they're no longer living, since now this is a quote from Pufendorf, right? Since the things that can become property are only useful to men while they're alive, and since the dead have no more role in the affairs of the world, it was not necessary for them to establish property to the extent to giving the owner the right to choose whom he wants to succeed to the goods he leaves on dying. It was sufficient that each dispose of the goods during his life, leaving to those who survive him the care of doing what they would judge appropriate when he was no longer alive. This is Pufendorf's Laws of Nature and People, Volume 4, Book 4, Chapter 10, Section 4, right? Thus prescribing to him the condition under which he can dispose of them, although in appearance, an impairment impairment of his right is in fact an extension of it. So therefore, what is it? What is by kind of impairing his rights that do this, right? It's actually extending his rights. So that's prescribing him the conditions under which he can dispose of them, his goods, right? The state does. In other words, in nature, what is this? Nature is man is dead. There's no more control over what he possesses. It's the art that it is in society that we have the ability to. It is society that grants something that nature cannot grant. In nature, Pufendorf shows that the nature of the right to property, the nature, in the state of nature in that sense, does not extend beyond the right of the proprietor. And the instant he's dead, no longer good. I read the quote, right? Thus, in prescribing to him the conditions by which he can dispose of it after his death, there can be trusts, there can be corporate bodies and things that were there for. There can be family rules and wills and how the family keeps the money and maintain it, how the land is transformed and protected. All of this extends. In other words, this is an extension. Not it is at one level. It looks like impairing rights. You can't just do what you want, but then you have restrictions on your right, rules on what your property can do and how it can be done. But this is an extension of your right, the right in that sense. It goes beyond it because once you're dead, you would have no control over it. Now, by the society gives you instruments, means, laws by which you then can control it after your death, right? In general, although the instrument of the laws that regulate power of private individuals in disposing of their own goods belong to the sovereign alone, the spirit of these laws, which the government should follow in applying them, is that from father to son and kin to kin, and the family's goods should leave the family and be alienated as little as possible. nor does that alienated, made alien to them. So therefore, the principle is father to son, kin to kin. The family's goods should leave the family and be in it as little as possible, so that they shouldn't be forced to go in that sense. They should preserve the family. This is what therefore the idea is the regulation is designed to protect the family, to keep the families together and the children in the future. Right. There is an obvious reason for this in favor of the children, for whom the right of property would be quite useless if the father left them nothing, and who, moreover, having often contributed by their labor to the acquisition of the father's goods, are in their own name associated with his right. So therefore, in other words, in other words, he may have, as a child or as a young adult, worked with the father to help the father's goods to get with it, and therefore, his contribution by their labor and to the acquisition of the father's goods, and therefore their own name associated with his right. Right, but another reason, more remote yet not less important, is that nothing is more pernicious to Moors for the and for the republic than continual changes of status and fortune among citizens. Changes that are the proof and the source of 1,000 disorders that upset and confuse everything, and due to which, since those who have been raised for one thing find themselves destined for another, neither those who neither those who raise nor those who fall can adapt the maxims or enlightenment suited to the new status, much less fulfill its duties. In other words, there's a danger. Too much. If the fortunes are going to be so up and down, up and down, up and down, they're not going to be what? It's going to be difficult for them to. In other words, they've been raised. You've been raised a certain way to find themselves destined. It's going to be very difficult for you to be. If you've been raised a certain way, that now you have now to find themselves that fortune has led them to be something else. And those who rise nor those who fall can easily adopt the maxims or wisdom, suited to their new status. That's to fulfill its duties. So therefore, this is why you should have these laws and regulations to prevent what disorder. What is the disorder? The thousands disorders of people whose wealth has been destroyed. The wealth has been destroyed, and the children's wealth has been wiped out, so that the children who've been raised a certain way have nothing now, and don't know how. And likewise, people who've been all of a sudden have so much money that they don't know how to spend it, don't know how to work with it, and it becomes harmful to them. Think of the lottery winners. Lottery winners are a perfect example of what the stories of what happens to most lottery winners. It's not good. What happens is they get all this money and then they don't know how to manage it. They don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to do it. And what ends up happening is they have more tragedy because of it. And therefore, the wealth, the new wealth is not something they really earned. It came to them, but they just didn't have the habits to be able to properly enjoy it or to exercise with it. And therefore, this is the problem. It becomes a disaster. Instead of a blessing, it becomes a curse, right? Well, the same. This is why you have to need regulation, control on these things to avoid vast people all of a sudden get vast changes of status that they don't know how to then behave, don't know how to handle it, don't know how to, and it becomes destructive to them. And by being destructive to them, it can be destructive to society. Remember his earlier warning about excess wealth and luxury. These things are disorders within a regime. Excess wealth as luxury is as much a disorder as extreme poverty. These need to be labor is good, work is good, vanity is bad, laziness is bad, venality, looking at is bad, hard work, effort. That's why he said in earlier sections here has been like this. Now he says, Now I turn to the topic of public finances. If the people govern itself, and there were nothing intermediary between the administration of the state state and the citizens. They would only have to pay their share as occasion arose in proportion to the public needs and the capacities of private individuals. In other words, there's no intermediating bodies. If the people govern itself, and there's there's nothing intermediary between the administration of state and the citizens, they'd only have to pay their share as occasions rose to the public needs and the capacities of the private individuals. And since no one would ever lose sight of the collection or use of the state revenue, neither fraud nor abuse could slip into their handling. So it's smaller scale, everyone needs it. They go there. There's no intermediate entities. The state would never be encumbered by debts, nor would the people overwhelmed by taxes. Or at least the assurance of its proper use would console peoples for the hardship of taxation. But things cannot be thus. And however limited a state territory may be, its civil society is always too numerous to be able to be governed by all its members. In other words, this is not going to be happening. You cannot. In other words, this is Moscow's iron law of oligarchy. As the size of the thing grows, the percentage of those who are in charge decreases. Okay, the number of people gets smaller and smaller and smaller compared to the rate proportion to the size of the thing, right? So therefore, there'll be few. In other words, those who govern will be fewer than the many, right? Not everyone will be able to participate. It's a participation problem, that Huntington raises in his book on American democracy promises and perils, right? The limitation. This is again Moscow's idea of the iron law of oligarchy in that sense. To members be able to govern in other hands. Public revenues must necessarily pass through the hands of the leaders, who, besides the interest of the state, all have their own private interests, which is not the last to be heeded. So therefore, once you have the larger thing, then you get a situation of government officials and magistrates. And then what happens is, well, the problem with them is these mediating entities handle the money and collect the taxes and handle the treasury and these things. The problem with them is that they also have their own interests, and in other words, they all have their private interests, which is not the last to be heeded. Therefore, this idea that it's sometimes that it's going to be heeded before the public interest, right? On the other hand, the people, perceiving the greediness of leaders and their extravagant expenses rather than the public needs, protest at being divested of necessities to provide superfluidities for the others. So they get resentment. All of a sudden what happens is those leaders will start thinking about their own needs, and therefore take more and more for the people. Then what happens is the people then see what? He says, the people perceiving that the leaders are greedy and that their extravagant expenses rather than the public needs. They're spending on things for their needs, not the public needs, and therefore they resent. They protest at being divested of necessities. That the money that could be the money that could be used for me and what I need is now being taken from me to pay for your extravagancies, my necessities versus your luxuries. At once, these maneuvers have embittered it to a certain once these maneuvers have embittered it to a certain degree, the most upright administration could not succeed in reestablishing confidence. You lose confidence. In other words, if you all of a sudden they don't trust you, once trust is lost, it's very difficult to regain trust. And if the contributions are voluntary, they're unproductive. If they're forced, they're illegitimate. And the difficulty of a just and wise economy lies in the cruel alternative of letting the state perish or attacking the sacred right of property, which is his mainstay. This is the big problem. Okay. People are only going to be willing to do this as if they see they're benefiting of it. If they don't see the benefit and they think it's benefiting the rulers at the expense of the people, or that the people paying for it, and therefore that they're paying for the luxuries of the leaders and not the needs of all. Whereas the money that they're having to be demanded from them to do this, to pay this, they view this as no longer voluntary. Because if it's voluntary, then the money doesn't come. But then if there's coercion used, then it's become the fact that this money is being used wrongly is illegitimate. And this is what Walter Williams made a very important point about taxes. Yes, the difference between taxes with the state uses coercion. State uses coercion to get us to pay our taxes. We don't pay taxes, we can be punished, right? The argument libertarians always use that coercion is, in other words, taxing is a form of extortion. That the mafia boss who comes there and say, "Hey, we're nice building you have here. Hate to see it burn down. Pay me protection money." And the idea that the state is kind of an extortionist. Now, Williams argued that no, there's a difference. That the state, when it taxes, can legitimately do this when, in other words, it's the question of people. I have to use force to make you pay for your good because you don't see it, you don't understand it. As long as the money is truly being spent for the public interest and not being abused or being spent for private interest, then that the money raised is being actually for a public good that all benefit from or participate in the benefit of, then and it's necessary and it's been agreed to by has been mostly democratically agreed to, or at least there's consensus on this. Then what happens is then it's okay. In other words, it's not extortion. Extortion is a private will. A private will. And a private will or dominant force that uses mere force. Yes, the state laws are a form of force, but also reasoning. It's a balance here of this. So but then the problem here is he's saying that this whole tension is the tension between either you have a if people don't have trust in the system, then it's going to be very difficult. Then what's going to happen is if voluntary is a contribution, then they're going to be unproductive, and if they're forced, they're going to be illegitimate, right? And thus, and the difficulty is a just and a wise economy. The difficulty of a just and wise economy lies in the cruel alternatives of letting the state perish or attacking the sacred, attacking the sacred right of property. Sometimes, in order to allow the state, if the good of the state, and remember, the problem here is that people might look at the state as all the state. No, I'm not going to. I'm going to be unreasonable. In other words, as long as the question is the policy is this, and the people have lost faith in it, then you have to use coercion. That's always going to be the problem, the big problem here in that sense. And this is what drives political economy kind of a headache, right? The first thing that the founder of a republic ought to do after the establishment of the laws is to find a capital sufficient for the upkeep of the magistrates and the officers, and for all the public expenses. So find a capital sufficient for the upkeep of the magistrates and the capital is called the auditium, or the public treasury. If it is in money, the public domain is the public. In other words, public is if it is in money, the public domain if it is in land, and the latter is much more preferable to the former for obvious reasons. In other words, money disappears. For land, well, you can always get new resources. It can generate revenue. It can always provide new every year. There's resources that can come out of it. Either that you're going to make a rent, either that you can sell this material. You have things that you can produce, and therefore it can be sold or action to pay off things. In other words, so therefore it's the art. the arium, the AE, the arium, or the public treasury. As if it's money, and public domain if it's land. The latter is preferable to the former for obviously because money disappears, right? It continues, right? Because inflation, currency spends, money doesn't really make itself up. The money disappears over time, right? If it collects money from people, then the money's there. It's a constant. It's not generating new wealth. Money does not. What the people pay, the taxes pay. Well, people may resent that. If it's land, okay, it's different. That makes revenue. Anyone who has given this matter enough thought can hardly have any other opinion than that of Bodin, who views public domain as the most honest and safe of all means of providing for the state's needs. Okay, Bodin's book on economy. This is again why this is why it always shocks me why Bodin hasn't got much more attention than he has in the history of political thought among the students of Strauss and the Straussians in that sense. Um, there are 7 ways in general to get money for public finance, in which they're included all that can be imagined. As to the first, which is public domain, it seems to me the most honest and the most assured of all. Bodin's 6 books of the Republic um, um, on this responsibility of the founder of the Republic to establish public revenues, compared Social Contract Book 2, Chapter 7. I get this, the idea of, again, this is the comparison to that. Um, and it is notable that Romulus's first care in the division of land was to designate a third of it for this purpose. In other words, Romulus and divided land, he gave a third to the public shared interest. I admit that it is not impossible for the proceeds of a badly administered public domain to be reduced to nothing, but it is not of the essence of public domain to be badly administered in that sense. Well, this is where um, uh, so, the infamous tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of Commons by Garrett Handel in 1968. Um, Let me just read a note about Tragedy of Commons for the purpose of this, right? The tragedy of commons is a very classical economic problem. The tragedy of commons is a metaphoric label for a concept that is widely discussed in economics, ecology, and other sciences. According to the concept, should a number of people enjoy unfettered access to a finite valuable resource, such as a pasture, they will tend to overuse it and may end up destroying the value altogether. To exercise voluntary restraint is not a rational choice for individuals. If they did, the other users would merely supplant them. Yet the predictable results is a tragedy for all. The metaphor of the title is 1968 essay by the ecologist Garrett Hardin. Another example he cited was a water course which all are free to pollute. But the principal concern of his essay was overpopulation of planets. So it's not like this. Um, this is the problem, but this is something even Aristotle hit it on. The concept of unrestricted access to resources becoming spent, where personal use does not always incur that expense, which has been discussed for millennia. Aristotle wrote that which is common is greatest number gets the least amount of care. Most men pay attention to their own and care less for what is common, right? Um, so this is again, I quote Aristotle here that kind of contrary this point. That in other words, okay, yes, this is right. That this is a problem. Um, It's not going to be badly administered. Well, no, tragic commons. No, no, no. He's maybe being a little too optimistic here. I admit that it's not impossible for it to proceed a badly administered public domain, but it is not of the essence of public domain to be badly administered. Well, in other words, okay, if it's being administered, if it's shared and used, then yes, it will. In other words, this is the way of the commons in that sense, right? Prior to any use of it, the capital ought to be assigned or accepted by the assembly of the people or the estates of the country. Now, the capital here is not, this capital is called, in other words, define capital for sufficient, not define a capital. This is capital wealth. This is capital economics. This is wealth. Okay, that's why I was tricked by that. The first thing a founder of a republic ought to do is establish its laws and define sufficient capital. Capital sufficient for its upkeep, not building a city, not capital city. Capital, and capital could be either money or land, right? This is the way things are. And he's saying, what is that? The danger here is that he'd prefer it to be land rather than treasure, money, because, in fact, he points to the example of Romulus, right? He says here, but he says that it's not impossible that this public domain can be badly administered and be reduced to nothing. But it's but the fact that it's being cared for or being things like this, I think this is the point where I think he's being a little more optimistic than modern economists would like to say. Prior to any use of it, this capital ought to be assigned or accepted by the assembly of the people, the estates of the country, which should then determine its use. Therefore, they should be accepted, it should be recognized. After this solemn ceremony, which renders the capital inalienable, in other words, it can't be changed, it cannot be alienated. It changes its nature, so to speak, and its revenues become so sacred that diverting the smallest thing to the detriment of its purpose is not only the most infamous of all thefts, but a crime of high treason. So in other words, it changes, it becomes inalienable. Once it's turned to the common, then the capital becomes what? It becomes sacrosanct in this sense. And that if you change, in other words, it becomes a crime. In other words, it becomes it's more stealing from the public good is even more evil act than, in other words, is more infamous than just mere normal theft, and it becomes treason, but a crime of treason. It is a great dishonor for Rome that the integrity of the questor Cato was openly discussed, and that an emperor rewarding a singer's talent with a few coins had to add that the money came from his family's goods and not from the states. In other words, it was the great dishonor of Rome that the integrity of a questor, someone who came to Cato, was openly discussed. Was he being honest? And that an emperor rewarded a singer's talent with a few coins had to add that the money came from his family goods and not from the state. But if there are few men like Galba, where will we find Catos? In other words, if there are few men like Galba, where will we find Catos? And once vice is no longer a dishonor, what leaders will be scrupulous enough to abstain from touching the public revenues left to their discretion, and not soon deceive themselves by pretending to confuse their vain and scandalous dissipations with the glory of the state and the means of extending their authority with those of increasing its power. It's increasing their authority by increasing. In other words, this vain idea that by giving the state more power, my glory will be better. In other words, it's not really expending the power is not necessarily the good thing the state needs for the utility of this. It is rather it's doing this for my vanity. Confuse vanity and scarce disposition with the glory of the state. It was the glory and personal interest their personal interest over the collective interest, the collective good, the collective entity, the shared collective entity, the common benefit. As soon as it deceives themselves by pretending to confuse their vain and scandalous dissipations, I mean, take their actions and events, with the glory of the state, and the means of extending their authority with those of increasing its power. It is above all in this delicate part of the administration that virtue is the only effective instrument, and that the magistrate's integrity is the only check capable of restraining his greed. In other words, virtue. You need character. You need good character. You need virtue of the magistrates, because the magistrate is not the administrator. Does not have virtue. Does not have good character. There's no check on his greed. The virtue needs to check greed here. The good character needs to check greed. The book and the book and the books. The books and all the records of administration serve less to reveal their infidelity than to cover them up. So that's the bookkeeping records, right? The books and all the records of administrators serve less to reveal their infidelities than to cover them up. And prudence is never as quick to imagine new precautions as is knavery to elude them. So that's remember. In other words, prudence is not quick, fast. In other words, knavery is faster than prudence to elude the dangers that is going to happen. Because why? Because record keeping, and these things, the books and records of public administrators can be used to cover up crimes as much as it is to reveal crimes. He says. Therefore, forget registers and papers, and place the finance and fit. In other words, not transparency. Transparency isn't the problem. See, our modern solution is transparency, right? But the argument is not transparency, character. Place the finance in faithful hands, people of good character, and if the society has good mores and good habits and good customs, the good character that people of good character exist, then put the finance in this. Transparency will it's good. What do you call faithful hands is better than transparency in that sense. Because why? Because a knavery is superior to prudence in devising means to bypass the transparency. So this is a criticism of transparency. Rousseau gives a criticism of transparency in that sense. Um, Therefore, forget registers and papers and place the finance in faithful hands. It is the only way to have them faithful administered. Once the public capital is established, the leader of the state are by rights its administrators. For this administration is part of the government. So therefore, the capital is to be administered by the leaders of the state, its rightful administrators. And for this administration is part of government, is always essential, although not always equally so. Okay, sometimes that things may be important to it. The influence increases in proportion as to that of other mechanisms diminishes. In other words, the influence increases in proportion as that of other mechanisms of government diminishes. So there's and it can be said that a government has reached the final stage of corruption when the only thing left of its vitality is money. So therefore, this is the utter corruption when we only care about money. When you only care about money, the only thing that's concerned about itself about money. I mean, that's America today, right? Only by spending programs, money, debt, national debt. The concern for the national debt and the focus on national debt is a sign of the corruption of the regime. Now, since all governments tend continually to weaken, this reason alone shows why no state can subsist if its revenues do not increase constantly. So, in other words, you need to constantly increase your revenues. You need to do it. In other words, you need a constant increase of revenues. No state can subsist if its revenues do not increase constantly. because governments will tend to weaken over time. And the danger of this is that corrupt government. The only way to avoid the negative consequences of corruption is to have constant revenues, to make sure it's going to be, and then hope that good people are handling it. The first awareness of the necessity for this increase is also the first sign of internal disorder of the state. In other words, you need to have increase. The first awareness of the necessity for this increase is also the first sign of internal disorder of the state. And the wise administrator, if he thinks of finding money to meet the present need, doesn't neglect to seek the ultimate cause of this new need. Just as a sailor seeing water flood his ship doesn't forget, as he gets the pump into action, to find a plug and find and plug the leak as well. In other words, the metaphor of the ship at sea. So not only do I pump the water out, I also fix the pole. So therefore, the administrator is what? Not only does he find the money to meet, but then fix the problem. Don't neglect to seek the ultimate cause of why this happened. And then result, plug the hole. From this rule, this rule follows the most important maxim of administration of finances, which is to work much more carefully to prevent needs than to increase revenues. In other words, you should try to reduce costs rather than increasing revenue. Reduce needs, reduce costs. Shrink the budget! My God, Rousseau is almost like a deficit hawk. Rousseau is shrink the government, shrink your needs, do less, not more. I mean, this is like almost a hardcore limited government argument here to a great degree. My God, I think what Rousseau might, this idea that John Rawls in his famous book on Theory of Justice, right? Oh, expansion of defending the welfare state. Rousseau would come here and say, "Mr. Rawls, going too far, going too far. You're going to by you increasing all these needs, you're going to increase the cost, and then once you increase the cost, you're going to have crisis, and that's going to bring your disorder, and that's going to bring corruption, and then everything's going to collapse." And you always have to get more and more and more and more and more and more. And as you get more and more and more and more, the corruption gets worse and worse and worse and worse. So it's better to shrink. In other words, he says, the wise administrator, as he thinks of finding money to meet his needs, doesn't neglect to do that. This really says that, in other words, it should, most maximum administration of finances, which is to work much more carefully to prevent needs or growing needs than to increase revenues. However diligent one is, help that comes only after the harm is done, and more slowly always leaves the states in distress. So therefore, in other words, more and more increasing of needs leads us to more and more need for revenue, which then leads us to more and more coercion, this resentment and trust breaks down, more and more harm. In other words, however one diligent is, help that comes only after the harm has been done, right? And more slowly always leaves the states in distress. While the remedy for one difficulty is being worked out, another is already being experienced, and the resources themselves produce new difficulties, and the resources themselves, new resources, produce new difficulties. They have to be spent, and they have to be done, and people get looking at this saying, well, why is that being spent? Maybe I want something also. If they're getting help, then I should get help. So that in the end, the nation is overwhelmed with debts. The people are downtrodden. The government loses its vigor, and it no longer does much of anything with a great deal of money. So they have lots of money, but it doesn't do much with it. Just think of the American budget. Okay, I believe it was this great maxim, when well established, that gave rise to the marvels of all governments of antiquity, which did more with parsimony than ours, with all their treasures. In other words, the ancients acquired effect parsimony. That is, they get the maximum for get the most you can from the least. Parsimoniousness is like the ability to maximize for the least. Whereas us, we have lots of wealth, we have abundance, and the wealth and the treasures doesn't allow us to do much anything. Okay. And it is from this, perhaps, that the common meaning of the word economy is derived, referring more to the wise handling of what one has than to the means of acquiring what one does not have. So the economy, this is why the economy meanings that they're referring to the wise handling of what one has, than of acquiring the means of this good economy. The word economy means maintaining a wise handling of what the resources and capital you have, not about acquiring capital. This is interesting. That not has than the means of acquiring what one does not have. Okay. Independently of public domain yields, independently of the public domain, the public land that's shared, which yields to the state in proportion to the probity of those who administer it. If one had sufficient knowledge of the whole force of the general administration, especially when it is limited to legitimate means, one would be amazed at the resources leaders have for anticipating all public needs without touching the goods of private individuals. In other words, once you have this, okay, independently of public domains, which yields the state proportion to the probability of those administered. If one, in other words, that okay, the public domain yields to the state in proportion to the probability, people who care for it well, and care and concern and faithfulness of those who administer it. And if one has sufficient knowledge of the whole force of the general administration, right? They have to understand what they're doing. They have knowledge of what they're doing and how they're administering and reducing costs and effectively managing the resources that they have, allowing it to grow and to allowing it to maximize growth and being utilized to grow more, not too much more, but to just to allow it to happen, right? One would be amazed at the resource leaders have for anticipating all needs without touching the goods of private individuals. This is why the founding America, for many reasons, up until the public lands, the land that they bought, the debt and the land and the transferring of that, the selling of it, and the resources and the resources from the public lands give the government revenue. That revenue can be then was the source why you didn't need to raise taxes much, or limited taxes in that sense. So therefore, if it's amazed with the resources leaders have for their anticipating all the needs without touching the good of private, as they are the masters of all the state's commerce, nothing is easier for them than to direct it in the manner that provides for everything, often without appearing to have any at hand. In words, that they can do that. The distribution of foodstuffs, monies, and merchandise is in just proportion according to time and place. Is the true secret of finance and the source of their abundance, provided that those who administer them know how to project their views far enough in advance and on the occasion accept an apparent and proximate loss in order to actually to obtain immense profit at some future time. In other words, short-term, think of long-term profit, not short-term gain, but long-term gain. So take a short-term loss to get long-term gain. And what is he doing here? He's, in other words, their abundance, their management of it, or distribution of food, monies, merchandise, in just proportionate to time and place. This is what is time and place? How do things are doing? Well, you need needs and wants, cost to benefit. All these things is a true secret of finance. In other words, handling of the question of food and the cost of food, the way it's produced, the foods and things, how they're exchanged, money, about how money is handled, and the way to make sure coin is like this, and how and even how debt is handled in that sense, and merchandise, the selling of goods and services in just proportions and according to time and places, the secret of true secret of finance. And the source of its their abundance, provided that those administrators know how to project that, in a way that they don't really they care for long-term benefit, long-term interest, not short-term benefit, right? When a government pays subsidies rather than to be paid for the export of wheat in years of plenty, and for its importation in years of scarcity, one needs to have such facts before one's eyes to think them true. In other words, you're exporting them when they're in years of plenty, and then importing them in years of scarcity, right? One needs to have such facts before they get the cycles of these things, and look at the cycles of the crops and how they're doing, how the consumption of crops and things like this, all these things. With them true, semicolon, and they would be treated as pure fiction if they had occurred long ago. Suppose that to prevent scarcity in bad years, the establishment of public storehouses was proposed. Right? Okay. In many countries, wouldn't the upkeep of such a useful establishment serve as a pretext for new taxes? Right. Yeah. In Geneva, such granaries established and maintained by the wise administration provided a public resources in bad years and the principal revenue of the state at all times. A la et dictat 25. Okay, this is it nourishes et dictat. It nourishes and enriches. As Decade points out, Rousseau's position is the opposite of the physiocrats like Quincey, who favored free trade instead of public granaries. Rousseau's attitudes towards Geneva see a social contract. So in other words, he prefers Geneva grains, Roman models. In other words, not free trade. The physiocrats believe in trade, commerce. Rousseau says, no, store, prepare, raise it, make granaries, have storage. Yes, it's going to cost money, but in other words, the free trade argument is, oh no, I'm not going to care about that one. It is, I'm just going to trade it. I'm going to have no costs and that. But then there's a problem when his bad years come. What happens? And all of a sudden you have trade deficits and things like this. Rousseau does not really do a free trade argument. What is that line again? It nourishes and enriches is the noble and just inscription one reads on the facade of buildings, right? In order to prevent here the economic systems of in order to present here the economic systems of a good government, I have often looked towards the system of that republic, Geneva, and Geneva. Happy thus to find in my homeland the example of wisdom and happiness I would like to see prevail. Sorry, to prevail in all economies, in all countries, If one examines how how the needs of a state grows, this will often be found to happen in the same way as it does for private individuals, less by true necessity than by the expansion of frivolous desires. And often expenses are increased solely to provide a pretext for increasing income. In other words, I want more, I want more, I want more, I want frivolous desires. I want to get more. I want to spend more to buy. In other words, what is true about states is also true about individuals. What's true about individuals is also true about states. So therefore, you're going to increase the size of government to do what? To do things that are frivolous, not necessary, not essential. As people do this, and this destruction. Thus, the state will sometimes profit from not being rich. And such apparent wealth is basically a greater burden than poverty itself would be. So, too much wealth can be dangerous in that sense. There may be hope. There may be hope. It is true of holding people in strict dependence by giving them with one hand what has been taken away from them with another. And this was the policy Joseph used with the Egyptians. In other words, you can create dependence. In other words, you hold people in stricter dependence by giving them with one hand and taking away with another, right? Rob Peter to pay Paul, right? And this is what Joseph used in the Egyptians. But this vain sophism is all the more fatal to the state, in that money does not return to the same hands from which it came. And the maxim of this sort only enriches idlers with spoils taken from useful men. So he says that okay, this is the sophism of robbing Peter to pay Paul, or taking one from that to give him again, right? No, this is bad, because it's what's going to happen is it's going to take resources. It's going to what he says. It's the money the money. His line is that's fatal to the state, because that the money does not return to the same hands from which it came. And that and this idea, you do this, and that's rob Peter take fall, right? Um, um, of this sort only enriches idlers, people who are idle, with spoils taken from useful men, men who have produced, men who have worked. The taste of conquest is one of the most odious and dangerous causes of this increase in need. So conquest, conquering. This taste, often engendered by one type of ambition that the type of ambition that the one it seems to represent is not always what it appears to be. And its true motive is not so much the apparent desire for the growth of the nation as the hidden desire to increase the internal authority of the leaders with the help of an increased number of troops, and by means of diversion that of war's objective creates in the mind of citizens. In other words, this is, in other words, that I'm doing great ambitions, I'm doing this. What is it? It means what? I get more power. With more power, I get more control. With more control, I get more status of who I am and that stuff. My vanities and power. So instead of actually delivering the good, what is really good, I'm concerned with my growing more power and getting more, becoming more powerful, not with what is really truly good in that sense. And this is the danger of that situation. Um, and this is why it's a threat to it in that sense, right? And then wars. I mean, this isn't this Higgins crisis and Leviathan. Isn't the argument here basically crisis and violence? You use war, that ambitious political users use crisis. What is that? Rahm Emanuel never let a good crisis waste, because the crisis allows you to expand your power. Get more and more power, get more power, expand government to get more power to help the political. It's that famous line from FDR in his New Deal: tax and spend, tax and spend, tax and spend, elect, elect, elect. Right? The political, you tax and spend, you buy votes, and the votes you keep in power. Okay, this is the way, and this is and this actually is undoing the health of the republic. So again, our friend Mr. Rousseau here would be very much condemning FDR. He's an anti-FDR. He would argue that FDR is wrong. FDR's policy is corruption. It's destroying the moral character of the republic in that sense. And therefore, the idea of conquest is actually not good. And here is an implied criticism of Rome in that sense, and a kind of maybe an apology for Sparta. And actually, again, to his Geneva is not a conquering city. In other words, Geneva has no ambition in that sense. So Rousseau is kind of a non-interventionist. There is this today in today's politics. I mean, it's very funny that Lou Rockwell Group, the Austrian economists, and their hostility to foreign intervention and foreign war, should always believe the caricature of Rousseau as this a democratic revolutionary and enemy of their position, where I'm sorry, he's more consistent than they are in that sense, right? And he shares with them the hostility of this. He does just things. I mean, you can see the kind of end of the Austrian economists in what he says here regarding foreign affairs. It's not about this; it's about desire to get bigger and bigger government. So, okay, what is at least very certain is that nothing is as downtrodden or miserable as conquering peoples, and even their successes only increases their misery. So therefore, in other words, nothing is downtrodden or miserable as conquering peoples. Their successes only bring misery. Being conquered is, in other words, it's very interesting. It's not the conquered is the worst, the conquering. Even if history did not teach us so, reason would be enough to show us that the larger the state, the heavier and more burdensome in proportion will become its expenses. So therefore, the more bigger the state, the more larger the state, the heavier, the more burdensome it is, and in proportion, it will become its expenses. It was more burdensome and heavy in proportion to that large of state will become its expenses. Right? For all the provinces must furnish their quota of the expenses of the general administration, and beyond that of each province must spend the same amount for its own particular administration, and if it is and as if it is independent. In other words, had to pay for its. In other words, even if in other words, it needs to raise the money for its overall effects of the thing, and the province also has to maintain itself, its own goals and goods, as even though they were independent, like doing these things. This is why it's same amount for its own particular administration as if it were independent. Added the fact that all fortunes are made add the fact that all fortunes are made in one place and consumed in another, which soon breaks the equilibrium between what is produced and what is consumed, and impoverishes a great deal of the countryside in order to enrich a single town. So therefore, what happens? There was this example, this idea that the production and consumption, and what happens is that that the countryside is impoverished, and the cities in grace and wealth, and the spending and consumption is there. Again, this is an attack on heavily large urban centers in that sense. Again, Rousseau, the agrarian in that sense, right? Very much an agrarian, echoing Aristotle, Book 6 of the Politics, right? The idea of farming democracy. Another source of the increase of public need is related to the preceding one. A time may come when the citizens, no longer considering themselves interested in the common cause, will cease to be the defenders of the homeland, and when magistrates would prefer to command mercenaries rather than free men, if only in order to use the former at the expedient time and place, and subjugate the latter all the better. In other words, not in other words, instead of citizens, you this is a criticism of today's modern army. Today's modern army is the argument is the American modern army is really a mercenary army. It's not a private mercenary army, but it is everyone gets paid. It's people who volunteer. Only those, therefore, not the whole society. Only a segment of society, usually the poor and that, and therefore there becomes a gap between what the military is and what the society is. The military is no longer representative of the people in that sense. And therefore, as Machiavelli warned in The Prince, that the tension between rulers and people, the third thing in Rome and the empire was the army. So that the people and the rulers and the subjects, and then the army, this became the third factor that complicated the empire. Um, Such was the state of Rome at the end of the Republic and under the emperors. For all the victories of the first Romans, like those of Alexander, had been won by brave citizens who knew how to shed blood for their homeland if necessary, but who never sold it. Never sold it. Number 26. They weren't sold. They didn't sell their Lord. They shed their blood but didn't sell it. Now 26. In the edition of 1783 and hereafter, Rousseau adds, it was only at the siege of Viti that the Roman infantry began to be paid. On Rousseau's preference for citizen army and his hostility to mercenaries, compare Aristotle's Prince, chapter 13, Social Contract, book 3, chapter 15, and consideration on the government of Poland, chapter 12, and especially the Denia response in the Pelide, book 1 3. War is sometimes, this is Duvernay response. War is sometimes a duty and is not made to be a profession. Every man should be a soldier to defend his freedom. None should be one to invade the freedom of others. And to die while serving one homeland is too noble a function to confide to mercenaries. Right? Marcus was the first pay people, and the war on Jugurtha, who dishonored the legions by introducing freedmen, vagabonds, and other mercenaries, having become enemies of the people for whose happiness they are responsible. Tyrants established standing armies in appearance to repress foreigners and in fact oppress the inhabitants. So the rise of standing armies, and instead of in order to raise these armies, it was necessary to take take farmers away from the land, so that the lack of farmers lowered the qualities of foodstuff and the cost of maintaining them, and introduced taxes that increased food prices. The first disorder caused the people to protest. To repress them, it was necessary to multiply the troops and consequently indignants. In other words, there were troops, and then therefore they had to do things, the punishments to make them to obey it, right? And the more despair increased, the more necessity it was to increase it further to prevent its effect. There was this ever cycle of coercion, more troops to coercion, more coercion. Um, on the other hand, these mercenaries whose worth could be judged by the price at which they sold themselves were proud of their dismacement, scorned the laws by which they were protected, and their brothers whom they ate, and thought it more honorable to be Caesar's satellites than Rome's defenders. In other words, this is a criticism of Caesar. In other words, they thought that Caesar's interest, they became tied to the interests of Caesar, the generals who provided for them, rather than to the people themselves, the Romans, the defenders of Rome. In other words, this is the danger of this. This is the danger of the Marius reforms. In fact, this could be a criticism of the American army in that sense. This is the American professional army, the professional military. The professional military may be a good idea, it may be a great wage war, but it's a dangerous thing. It can be a dangerous force in that sense. We should have a citizen army. You should have the citizen army, militias and things. But that was changed because the idea that in other words, they became a professional army in order to protect the interest of the Navy had always been protected. The Navy wasn't reverted to the states, but the Army was reverted to the militias. Right, the militias was just organized. The creation of the Army after the First World War and the alteration of the militias under the National Guard Act in 1917 still had the crisis of this, and that World War One, the 1940s changed the military, that it didn't revert back to this and try to become the post-war military, which because of the threat of the Soviets. Wasn't that the concern of Eisenhower and his famous the military-industrial complex, which also involved Congress? Commit to blind obedience. Committed to blind obedience, their job was to hold a dagger over their fellow citizens, ready to murder all at the first signal. It would not be difficult to show that this was one of the main causes for the ruin of the Roman Empire. Um, the invention of artillery fortifications has, in our time, forced the sovereigns of Europe to reestablish the use of standing armies to defend their fortresses. But although the motives are more legitimate, it is to be feared. It is to be feared that the effect will be equally pernicious. It is no less necessary to depopulate the countryside to raise armies and set up garrisons. To maintain them, it is no less necessary to oppress the people. And in recent time, these dangerous establishments have been growing so rapidly in all our countries that one can only foresee the future depopulation of Europe, and sooner or later, the ruin of the peoples who inhabit it. So, therefore, um, this is the time he's writing this. He's thinking about the wars of this, and the wars do happen. There is a depopulation in that sense, right? In the modern technological world, in that sense, what it was at the time. The two world wars, and then the economy that produced after the World War produced a kind of declining European populations, but at the same time, huge economic need. That's why there's the need to bring in migrants. The argument goes, the economic argument goes. However this may be, it should be apparent that such institutions necessarily upset the true economic system, which derives the principal's revenue of the state from the public domain, and leaves only the unfortunate resources of subsidy and taxes, which remains for me to discuss. So therefore, subsidization and taxes. In other words, however this may be, it should be apparent that such institutions upset the true economy system, which deprives on revenue of the state, public domains, and it now leaves only the unfortunate resources of subsidization and taxes, which remains for me. In other words, that those institutions rely on subsidization and taxes. It is necessary to remember at this point, on the basis of the social compact, that the basis of the social compact is property. And its first condition that each person continues in the peaceful employment of what belongs to him. Right? This is the social contract, what belongs to him in that sense. It is true that by the same treaty, each person obligates himself, at least tacitly, to pay his share of the public needs. But since this engagement cannot undermine the fundamental law and suppose that the taxpayers acknowledge the evidence of need, it is apparent that in order to be legitimate, this payment ought to be made willingly, not through a private will, as if it was necessary to have each citizen consent, but only, and he only ought to provide what he pleases, which would be direct contrary to the spirit of a confederation, but through a general will, majority vote, and based on proportional rates that leaves no room for an arbitrary assessment of taxes. So, in other words, proportional rates, in other words, that means proportional to this, that rates no arbitrary sense of tax. So, therefore, you have a percentage, in other words, proportional based on percentage, that you have to pay a certain percentage. Okay? A certain percentage, not arbitrary. Proportional in the sense, maybe even in terms of maybe some people have more and less in that sense, but there's it's not arbitrary in that sense. The argument is that there is, and it has to be what, not the. It's not the idea of every person themselves, but it's not the voluntary choice of individual will. It's the voluntary choice of the general will. So therefore, the general will decides this, that this is the people collectively in the act of deciding and voting determines the idea of this, the generation of the general will that makes the decision here. This truth, that taxes cannot be legitimately established except by the consent of the people or its representatives, has been generally acknowledged by all philosophers and legal theorists who have acquired any reputation in the matters of political right, including Bodin himself. 27, right? At 27. See Bodin, The Six Books of the Commonwealth or Republic, Book 6, Chapter 2. The first draft of this passage reads: The truth that taxes cannot be established legitimately except by the consent of the people as representatives has been generally acknowledged by all the philosophers and legal theorists, such as Grotius, Locke, and Pufferdorf, who have, in other words, he added as Grotius, Locke, and Pufferdorf, who have acquired any reputation in matters of political right, if there are any. Some, like Bodin, have given the prince the right to raise taxes on his authority, that establishes maxims that appear contrary. Note, note in note that in both the draft and the final text, Rousseau uses the phrase "the people" and his representatives. And compare Social Contract, Book 3, Chapter 15. Okay. Mhm. So while a few have established maxims that appear contrary, right, it is easy to see the private motives that inspire them to do so. They attach so many conditions and restrictions that when it comes down to it comes down to the exactly same thing. For whether the people can refuse or the sovereign should not require is indifferent in the terms of right. They should refuse, the people refuse, or the sovereign should not require is indifferent in terms of right in that sense, consent. And if it is only a question of force, it is completely useless to examine what is or is not legitimate. So if it's only force, I can do what I want. If my power to tax is what I then there's no concern for legitimate. The need to concern whether it's legitimate or not legitimate is only because it has to be based on consent. It has to be based on because people will willingly when it's when they when it's people will consent to when it's legitimate, and they will not consent when it's illegitimate. Right? That's the whole point about this. Right? That's why it becomes an issue in that sense. The contribution, um, the contribution levied from the people are of two kinds: some on property, which are collected on the basis of things, and another personal, which are paid by the head, per capita tax, right? Per capita versus property tax, two types, right? Both are given the names taxes or subsidies. When the people set the total amount it gives, it is called a subsidy. So therefore, they said that this is the subsidy. Subsidy is the total amount that it. When the people set a total amount it gives, people give. This is a subsidy. When it gives all the proceeds of a form of taxation, it is called a tax. So they give something that this is a subsidy. If it's material, if they give everything and they give it, and it's a subsidy in that sense. But if it's when it gives all the proceeds of all the proceeds of a form of taxation, it is called a tax. In the book Theory of the Laws, one finds that assessment by head is more in keeping with servitude and property taxation more suited for freedom. Um, the tax by head is most natural to slavery. The tax on merchandise is the most natural to freedom because it is related in a less direct manner to the interests of persons. The Spirit of the Laws, Book 13, Chapter 14. As De Wraith point out, Rousseau twists Montesquieu's preference for indirect taxation by substituting property taxes for Rousseau's tax on merchandise, VAT, a sales tax, impost sur la merchandise. More broadly, it is of interest to compare Montesquieu's assessment throughout Book 813 with Political Economy, and especially Rousseau's proposal for progressive income tax in the following, the idea of, otherwise, that this is there is a kind of progressive income tax, or proportional income tax. So therefore, this is the idea that it's that property tax is for freedom, right? Tax property taxation, not sales tax. This is Montesquieu. This is a distortion of. He's kind of distorting Montesquieu. That would be incontestable if all shares by head were equal. It would be incontestable if all shares by head were equal, for nothing would be as disproportionate as such taxation. And the spirit of freedom consists above all in the precise respective proportion. So therefore, if everyone had the equal share, in other words, equal amount, all shares were equal. But what is meant by equal? Equal percentage of what is, in other words, or the amount. The amount is due. Therefore, the value of this, the amount, and everyone gets an equal share. That would be unfair. This idea that you then tax a percentage, but that's usually a percentage of what? Percentage of your capital, your money, your resources, your assets. What is this? The per head cap is usually a thing. So you have to have some kind of means to do this, right? And I think this is why he prefers property in that sense, right? The idea is that it's your property is the basis of your things, and it's proportionate, a percentage proportion of your property is taken, right? That's it's not equal in terms of the amount, but it may be equal in terms of percent, or maybe it'd be even different percents, right? It would be incontestable if all shares I had were equal. Nothing would be more disproportionate in such taxation. The spirit of freedom consists above all in the precise respecting of proportions, right? The spirit of freedom consists above all in the precise respecting of proportions. But if taxation by head is exactly proportionate to the means of private individuals, as the French captation would be, and thus has simultaneously both a property and a personal basis. Like this is based on the property assets you have in that. And it is this most equitable and consequently most suitable to free men. So therefore, this is a both property and personal basis. There was the personal basis proportional to based on their means to pay, right? At first, these proportions appear very easy to observe, because being relative to each person's status in the world, the indications are always public. But besides the fact that greed, reputation, and fraud knows how to leave no overt traces, it is rare that all elements that should be included in these calculations are taken into account. Say for greed, reputation, fraud, can leave no traces, can know how to leave no traces. Therefore, it's rare that in other words, the calculations of these things going to be able to, rare that all the elements should be included in the calculations. First, one should consider the relationship of quantities, according to which, all other things being equal, someone has 10 times more goods than the another should pay 10 times more. Second, the relationship of use, that is the distinction between the necessary and the superfluous. Someone who has only the bare necessity should pay nothing at all. Taxation on someone who has superfluities more than he can need, right? If need be, approach the totality of what exceeds his necessity. In other words, okay, what you don't need, you have excesses. Okay, I tax you I tax it so you don't, you know. Okay, this is where Rousseau kind of gets into that weird like proportional. What you need. Therefore, we have to know what you need, right? But the problem is, what do we need? It is subjective. To this, he will reply that considering his rank, what would be superfluous for an inferior man is necessary for him. But this is a lie, for a nobleman has two legs just as a cowherd, and only has one stomach as he does. Moreover, this so-called necessity is so far from necessity to his rank, than if he had the sense to renounce it for a praiseworthy cause, right? He would be all the more more respected. So if you give him all these excess of things that he had of this, he would be respected and gives it up. The people would bow before a minister who would go to the council on foot because he had sold his carriages when the state was in need and urge. That was his idea. He sacrificed. Yeah, but then, okay, but there's problems. There's cost. He does that. He sells the car. He sells his car to do that, but now it takes him longer to do things. Here is the problem. I mean, there is a problem here. This is where Rousseau gets kind of upset. He assumes that cost is there's a constancy in it. That value is. I think there's a almost a exception that value is constant and value is objective and not subjective. That's one problem. Second problem is the problems of these things are not going to be. There is going to be different needs for different people based on the things, and sometimes that things that he says about getting rid of the carriage so that this it might be a great thing. It might show these great virtue, but it might end up actually causing waste. Make him inefficient and you know not necessarily good in that sense. Right? Because he might give an urgent need, but now he has to. It's waste time, opportunity costs, and lost. Finally, the law does not require magnificence of anyone, Lord, and decorum never provides a reason to go against right. So, what is against justice? What is right? So, therefore, in other words, decorum never provides a reason to go against what is just, what is right, against right. And there's no law that requires magnificence in this sense. Well, this is where Aristotle might disagree with him. Uh, um, here he's Machiavelli. Here on this, he echoes Machiavelli against liberality. He's agreeing with the prince on liberality, whereas magnificence is liberality on the social level. So therefore, why is but isn't this what he's condemning? I mean, this is where Aristotle would say to him, "Hey, Mr. Rousseau, you're kind of wrong here. Magnificence is not something individual. Magnificence is for the public good. The spending money for the well-being of the city in that sense. That's what magnificence is in the classic virtue, not just showing off my wealth. That's not even liberality. That is boastfulness. Right? That is the magnificence of anyone. Okay, magnificence if it's true magnificence. See, it does not require magnificence of anyone. That's not true. It does so. It would encourage. It doesn't require it, but encourages it because why? Because why? The magnificence of that is showing how much you love the city, how you love the things, and in fact, the rich should have. The Aristotle would argue that the city should encourage the wealthy to show magnificence, the public acts and public things, and therefore, by doing these public acts and public providing these things, they are showing their patriotism, their love of their country. Um, So this is that finally law does not require magnificence. This is okay, Aristotle would disagree. Decorum never provides a reason to go against right. That's here's the problem. What about just what happens if just can it be against decorum to be just? Maybe justice is too high of a demand in a certain place. Being just might require you to abandon your. Remember the story about I should not recognize my son. My son's a crook. I should turn my son in. People look at that as unnatural for a father, right? So therefore, there's decorum, and decorum might require you to protect your guilty child, right? So therefore, this is a much more complicated question here, and I think he wants simple mores. In other words, Rousseau assumes a concept of simple mores. But the problem with advanced civil society is the mores become complicated. This is why I think Montesquieu's a little better than him in that sense. And he wants to go simply. He wants to go back to more simple modes. And the third relationship that is never taken into account, but that should always come first, is that of the utility of each person derives from the social confederation, which strongly protects the immense possessions of the rich and barely lets the poor wretch enjoy the hut he built with his own hands. In other words, that that the utility of each person derives from the social contract has more impact on the rich than it does on the poor. But Barry lets the rich enjoy that. Aren't all the advantages of society for the powerful and the rich? That's the question, right? Aren't all the luxurious jobs filled by them alone? Aren't all the pardons and all the exemptions reserved for them? And isn't public authority entirely in their favor? When an when an esteemed man steals from his creditors or cheats in other ways, isn't he always sure of impiety? The beating he gives, the violent action he commits, even the murders and assassinations he's guilty of, aren't these affairs passed over in silence and forgotten over in 6 months? Now, these are the kind of criticisms, right? These are the kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Uh, isn't the same man if the same man is robbed and the forces of law and order go into action immediately, and woe to the innocent who he suspects? Does he not have to travel through dangerous places? Does he have to travel through dangerous places? He is escorted through the countryside. So therefore, this is like this. And so that forgotten in 6 months, and this man has been robbed, and so therefore that's like that. He's escorted. Does the axle of his carriage break? Then everyone rushes to his aid. Is it noisy near his door? He says a word, and all is silent. Does the crowd annoy him? He gives a sign, and everything becomes orderly. If a cart driver is in his way, his men are ready to beat him. If 50 honest pedestrians going about their business will be trampled before an idle, good-for-nothing coach is slowed down. In other words, is a cart driver in his way? His men will beat him, and if 50 pedestrians are going about their business, will be trampled for the good of nothing. That's right. All these attentions doesn't cost him a penny. They are the rich man's right, and not the price of riches. Therefore, they are the right of the rich man in that sense. So here's starting here we get the position of the rich man, right? So this is these questions in that sense. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Right? Now then I have to give this that was the rich man, the conditions of the right of the rich man. Not the price of riches, but the rights of a rich man's right, what is just for him. This is his view of justice in that sense, right? This is his view of this is the view of justice of the wealthy. How different is the picture of the poor man? The more humanity owes him, the more society refuses him. 1. All the doors are closed to him, even when he has the right to make them open. So, therefore, the more humanity owes him, the more society refuses him. All the doors are closed to him, even when he has the right to make them open. And if someone obtains justice, it is with greater difficulty. It is with greater difficulty than another would obtain a pardon. So justice would be that if the people obtain a pardon. If there are corvées to do, troops to be raised, he is given preference. two, three, four, four. The fifth one is, in addition to his own burden, he will always bear the one which his richer neighbors has the influence to be exempted. So, let's count this. One, two, three, four, five, five. Okay, one, oh, him refused. Doors closed to him, even that they open. Three is to obtain justice more difficult than independent. If there's corvées or draftees for the fifth is the burden he pays that the rich man is exempted. And at the slightest accident that happens to him, everyone abandons him. Six, if his poor cart tips over, far from being helped by anyone, I consider him lucky if he avoids the passing insults of the flippant servants of some young duke. Seven, in short, all free assistants flee him when needed, precisely because he has nothing to which to pay for it. Eight, and I consider him a lost man if he has the misfortune to have an honest soul, an attractive daughter, and a powerful neighbor. In other words, again, not nine. Again, remember the story about the thing about the biblical test. The poor man who has an honest soul, an attractive daughter, and a powerful neighbor. Okay, this is the danger. I consider him a lost man if he has something like that. Another point, another point, no less important to note, is that the losses of poor men are far less repairable, than those of rich, and that the difficulties of acquiring always increases in proportion to need. In other words, that the rich have easy to acquire. The poor, it's very difficult to acquire. So therefore, the losses of poor men are far less repairable than the losses to the rich. The rich people can afford their losses. The poor can't. And this is why, because it's the difficulty of acquiring is proportional to their need. Nothing produces nothing. It is as true in business as in physics. Money breeds money, and um, the first gold pistole is sometimes harder to earn than the second million. It goes even further. All the poor man, all that the poor man pays is forever lost to him, and remains in or returns to the hands of the rich. Okay, this is very, and since the proceeds of taxes go sooner or later only to those who take part in the government or who are close to it, they have, even in paying their share, an evident interest in the increasing taxes. So the rich like taxes, increasing taxes. The rich pay for that. Let me summarize in a few words the social compact of these two estates. For you need me, for I am rich, and you are poor. So let us come to an agreement between ourselves. I shall permit you to have the honor of serving me on the conditions you give me what little you have for the trouble I shall take to command you. So this is the words of the social compact of these two estates. Right? If all these things are carefully combined, it will be found that in order to impose taxation in an equitable and true proportional way, assessment should not be made solely in proportion to the goods of the taxpayer, but in the proportion composed of the difference between their condition and the superfluity of their goods. How much more they have? The condition. What is their condition? What is the difference between the conditions of the people, and how many excess of goods? of resources and goods. A very important and very difficult calculation made daily by multitudes of honest clerks who know arithmetic, but which a Plato or a Montesquieu would only have dared to undertake with trembling, and after imploring heaven for enlightenment and integrity. In that sense, in other words, this calculation of these things, knowing the difference of these two things, the proportion of the good payers, that is, proportion to their difference of their condition. What is their conditions, and the superfluity of goods, and that clerks do this all the time by simple method. And that in other words, multitude of honest clerks who know arithmetic, right? But Plato, because what is it? What is the relative condition of something? That's right. Plato and Montesquieu would ask, what is the relative condition of this? It's not that easy to see that. The appearance of a thing versus the reality of the thing. Um, okay, I'm going to stop here. I think we're going to stop here, and that's going to stop here. This is going to do it. If you have any questions or any things, I think this is. I think I'm going to end here for the purpose of this. Is where I said I would end on this point, and I'm going to continue the next thing. If you have comments, questions, or things that you want to address, please post them below, and once I'll see them, I'll respond to them. If you like the video, like it, hit the like button, share it on social media, share it on there, share it with your friends, get it out. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. Another thing you can do is if you didn't like it, okay, you hit the down things, but say why you didn't like it in the notes below in the comment section, what you didn't like about it. If you want to follow me in social media, the links are below, the social media links. If you want to see more about my scholarship and look at my research of who I am as an academic and that stuff, you can follow my academic social media below. And then if you want to help me to do what I do, because this site isn't monetized, I'm not big enough yet to do this. You can do so by becoming a member, subscribe to our Patreon. Of course, it's no one's done it really yet because my size is too small. The percentage numbers like this, so it's kind of like a lose-lose situation. But I ask anyway, so hopefully that they were doing it. So it'd be nice that something did this. Again, we have one more. We have one more. Another way you can help me is to also then buy my books listed below. The books are listed below that you can get through Amazon or any online source, or buy it from your local bookstore. Buying the Lulu one gives me the most money, but then again, you're not here for Aristotle. So, people here for Aristotle might look for it. I'm going to stop here. Eesh, what can I say? It's tough. We continue next time on the last part of political economy, which is the conclusion, which kind of, I think we should go maybe one, two things. I think the conclusion is very short at the end, and it's going to continue some themes of theme about taxation, right? But we'll stop here. And it's on Monday, Wednesdays. Again, we finish one more, I think. Hopefully, that should end it. And then Tuesday, Thursdays is Schmidt. We're still doing Schmidt, and that should be a couple more weeks of Schmidt. That's it. And then Fridays, of course, is the live stream or things like that. Well, that's it. Take care. Have a good day. Bye bye. See you later.